The Kremlin says that many of those involved in protest against the jailing of opposition politician Alexei Navalny are hooligans and provocateurs. Spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was speaking a day after tens of thousands rallied in cities across Russia to call for Navalny's release. More than 5,000 people were arrested during the demonstrations. Critics accused the police of using excessive force.
They were warned, but they marched anyway. Anti-government protesters all over Russia demanding the release of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. They defied a ban by the Kremlin. The response was brutal. In a show of force, many were arrested. Some were beaten, some hit with taser-like devices. In Moscow alone, thousands marched, constantly changing their route in an attempt to evade the police. Some gathered outside the prison where Alexei Navalny is being held. For many of them, the protests are about more than just the opposition leader's arrest. Protesters also say they are marching against corruption and for more democratic freedoms in Russia.
Adults are used to being told what to do, being controlled, but young people are used to organizing themselves. That's why I came here today, because I want a stake in what is happening in my country.
It's a disgrace. They've stolen everything from us. I live near oil and gas fields, and they're just stealing it all.
I have a 2-year-old son, and if Putin stays in power for the next 16 years, as he's planning to, then my son will grow up with him. And I don't think anything good will come of it.
Moscow was still asleep Sunday when protests started in Russia's Far East, in Siberia. As dawn spread across Russia, pro-Navalny rallies spanned across the country's 11 time zones. But so did the forceful response by the authorities. Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg, was no exception. Some call this Russia's most aggressive and fear-inducing nationwide operation. But others say the government's attempts to overwhelm the protests might actually fuel the flames of the Russian opposition and the voices calling for change.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Emily Sherwin. Emily, walk us through the Russian government's reaction here.
Well, Sarah, we heard today, as you said, from the Kremlin spokesperson who called the protesters hooligans and provocateurs. He basically said that the police force that we saw yesterday was justified because you can't talk to hooligans. And what we also have been seeing is a bit of a crackdown even over the past week, since the last protest that happened last week, on opposition activists, on protesters, with criminal cases being opened, with administrative cases being opened for taking part in an unsanctioned rally, for blocking traffic, and for breaking the rules of gathering during a pandemic. Today, Alexei Navalny's wife, was fined for taking part in a protest that apparently blocked traffic. So we've been seeing, and we continue to see now, a bit of a crackdown on the opposition. And on state TV, the reporting has basically just been painting these protests as small, very insignificant, and also painting the protesters as violent.
Given that reaction, Emily, just put it into context for us. How big of a threat does this unrest, do these protests pose to Vladimir Putin?
I think that any protests are a real threat to the Kremlin. Basically, street protests are the Kremlin's nightmare, I would say. And these peaceful mass protests that we've been seeing, that we saw this weekend and that we saw last weekend as well, are a particular threat because they're not just taking place in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is the normal scenario for Russia. They're also spread much wider over cities across the country, over 11 time time zones, from cities in the Far East, in Vladivostok to Siberia to the Urals. So that's a new and unprecedented element to these protests. And also, it seems that a lot of new people have been coming out, people who usually don't take part in opposition protests. A lot of the people that I spoke to here in Moscow said it was their first time last week and this week as well. Apparently, around 40% of protesters last week had never taken part in opposition protests before. And many of the people that I spoke to said that this is about much, much more than Alexei Navalny. They said that this is about corruption in the ruling elites, also the way that Alexei Navalny has been treated by the prison service, by the court system, which many perceive as unfair. And they say they just want a different Russia, a more democratic Russia.
Emily, just briefly, what is likely to happen to Navalny?
Well, there's a court hearing tomorrow that could turn his suspended sentence into real prison time. We'll have to wait and see whether he gets that jail time and how long he'll be put in prison. I think that most likely the Kremlin, people in the Kremlin are thinking about what to do with him, especially after these big protests. They don't want to make a martyr of him and cause more people to take to the streets.
Correspondent Emily Sherwin with The View from Moscow. Thank you.